Hello everyone, my name is Sydney. I'm a sport nutritionist contracted with the Canadian Sport Institute, and I will be walking you through this first module titled Nutrition Foundations. So let's get started. So our agenda for this module includes talking about the macronutrients as the foundation of our nutrition. We'll talk about where to find these in our diet, what nutrient-dense foods are, and how to put it all together on our performance plates. So before we jump right in, I think it's important to spend some time thinking about why nutrition is so important and understanding why it's worth taking some time and dedicating some energy to learn about the nutrition content of food and really understand how this can help you with your sport performance. So balanced eating can help to provide enough energy to support your training so you're feeling good going into practice and feeling good and recovering quickly afterwards. So it can help us recover quicker. It can help to prevent nutrition-related deficiencies. And balanced eating can also help to prevent injuries and illnesses. And when we think about why nutrition is so important, we want to think about how all of these relate. Think about all of these factors. And nutrition is not just about one of these things, and we need to be aware of how our nutrition can impact all of these pieces of the puzzle. So for example, an athlete may want to improve recovery, but they also might want to optimize their weight at the same time. And we want to make sure that we're eating enough to provide that amount of energy that we need and make sure we're eating high energy foods and high nutrient foods so that we are preventing deficiencies at the same time. So overall, we want to, of course, consider our own enjoyment of food as well. So we don't want to be eating foods that we don't love or they're not appealing. We don't want to feel miserable when we're eating. So we really want to be able to incorporate some of the foods that we truly love and enjoy the foods that we're eating. And sometimes we might make food choices based on what we like, but at the same time, we should also consider how it can contribute to all of these factors in relation to our performance and our overall health. So how do we approach balanced eating then in order to achieve all of those great benefits that we just looked at? Well, one way to go about it is looking at this sport nutrition pyramid. So starting with the bottom, we want to build up a really strong foundation first. And this foundation should be built off of our balanced eating, made up of our whole foods. So thinking about your meals that you're having day in and day out, your recovery snacks, your hydration practices, all of the things that you're doing every day. So these are your real meals, your real food on a regular basis. This is what should make up that really strong foundation. And once that foundation is built up, then we can add the second layer here, which would be more of our sports foods. So some examples would be things like our sports bars, our gels, our blocks, our sports drinks, and these may play a role when it comes to regattas or really heavy training days, travel. So they're not necessarily bad and they may find a role in our diet, but they certainly can't be our foundation. And this is where a lot of athletes make the mistake of moving on to this level too quickly. So they layer on their sports foods too quick without building up that really strong foundation first. So that's why the purpose of this module will be to go over that really strong foundation so we have a great understanding. And then last but not least, that third level there would be our supplements. So these would be giving us maybe that extra 1% of performance benefit over our competitors. And these would be things like our supplements or ergogenic aids. And these may have a role as well. So for example, if a doctor prescribes a supplement for you to treat a vitamin D deficiency, then it would be a good idea to take that. But things like caffeine, bicarb, creatine, and other supplements that sound appealing or really fancy at the higher level, they might not actually have that much of an impact on athletes' performance unless they have a really strong foundation. So they're not going to have a benefit unless we have that really strong foundation to start with. So not to say that there's no place for those supplements, we just want to make sure that we're building up from the ground first with those whole foods, then layering in on those sports foods once we have that strong foundation, and then maybe in a case-by-case basis, weighing our pros and cons, we might add in those supplements. And with this pyramid, our goal is to make sure that we have that healthy body so that we're performing at our best. Next, let's talk about macronutrients. It's important to discuss the nutrients that make up our whole foods as part of that foundation for our sports nutrition pyramid. So the 3 macros that we will focus on include carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And all of these contain calories. And that's why they're called macro. So macro meaning big. Big molecules that give us energy, give us calories. So carbs, carbohydrates, are a macronutrient that provides energy for your training. And more importantly, they provide quick energy. And this is important because you don't paddle slowly, you paddle fast, and you need that quick energy. Carbs are also important to give us a mental focus while we're training, while we're performing, and they'll also play a role in our digestion as a source of fiber. Proteins will also provide calories, but our body prefers to use these more so to help our muscles recover and less about that energy. So anytime you're training or paddling and your muscles get sore, you need protein to help repair those damaged muscles. You'll also need protein for your muscles in order to help change or adapt to different training loads, as well as to help repair after an injury. And fats, these macronutrients also provide calories, but they also play more roles in the body. So for example, the brain contains a lot of fat, and it's important that we consume some essential fats in our diet to help support the brain. Fats also help with our eyesight, and they help our body make hormones. One other important thing about fats is that they help our body absorb fat-soluble vitamins in our meals. So definitely important to incorporate essential fats in order to keep all of our systems working properly. And last but not least, we have water. And I'll dive into water a little bit deeper in the module, but keep in mind that water and fluid in general is really important for your performance as well as your overall health. It's important that we drink water regularly to stay hydrated to prevent dehydration, as well as to help our body remove excess waste products built up during exercise from the muscle. Now that we know about macros, let's understand where we can find them in our foods, because we don't eat macronutrients, we eat food. So knowing which foods contain these macros can help when it comes to building up our whole food foundation. And it can also help us to make better decisions. So for example, if you need more energy, you need to know which foods will help with that. So let's go through each of these now. So for carbohydrates, we can find carbohydrates in starchy foods like our breads, pastas, and cereals. They are also found in things like bars, granola bars, oats, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and some of our starchy vegetables like corn, and as well as beans, so chickpeas and lentils. We can also find carbohydrates from our fruit. We have natural sugars in whole fruits, whether it's fresh or frozen. We can also find some in juice. Some dairy products also contain carbohydrates. So we do have some natural sugars in our dairy, but we also have added sugars if you're consuming dairy products that are flavored. So for example, chocolate milk or fruit flavored yogurt. there are some added sugars to these products. And it's not to say that those added sugars aren't good, they are just a different type of carbohydrate. And so something to keep in mind that some of these dairy products, as well as these added sugars like syrups, anything that's used in baking or baked goods, will be a source of added sugars. So it may not be the healthiest type of sugar to have all the time, but it certainly can have a place around our training. So it's just important to remember that we have many options when it comes to carbohydrates, whether it's coming from starchy foods, fruits, dairy products, or some of those added sugars. And all of these are sources of that fuel, of that energy. So where can we find protein? A lot of our protein is found in our meats. Our red meat, fish, poultry like chicken and turkey, as well as seafood. And these are some of the common ones. We can also find protein in some of our alternatives, so things like our eggs, cheese, and milk. And we can also get plant-based proteins from foods like nuts and seeds, nut butter, peanut butter, as well as our beans like kidney beans, chickpeas, and lentils. So there's lots of variety and lots of foods that contain protein. And some may be better options during certain situations. So for example, let's say you don't have a way to keep your lunch or your dinner refrigerated. You have to keep it in a gym bag or in your bag, and you have no way to keep it cold. So it might be a better option to have a peanut butter sandwich and use the peanut butter as your source of protein rather than a chicken breast. It would stay safe at room temperature all day. And that's not to say that one protein source is better than the other. They just might be more convenient in different situations. And just know that there are many different sources of protein in the diet. And you can choose based on your situation, your preference, and how much time you have to cook, and so on. So let's talk about fats next. There are two groups of fats, so we can categorize one group as anti-inflammatory or quote-unquote healthy. Other terms you may have heard include omega-3 or omega-9 fats, and these are primarily plant-based. So coming from our nuts and seeds, olive oils, and avocado. However, an exception to this would be things like fish. Our fish oils would be a great source. And the other group of fat would include inflammatory, so quote-unquote unhealthy fats. Other terms you may have heard include omega-6, trans fats, or saturated fats. And we can find these in primarily our processed foods or our deep fried foods like fries, battered fish, pizza, sweets, and baked goods. And not to say that these foods are inherently unhealthy, but the fats in these foods are less healthy than the other types, the anti-inflammatory types. So the whole idea here is to try and include more of our anti-inflammatory fats and a little bit less of those inflammatory fats. So let's talk about fluids and where we can find fluids in the diet. Well, a pretty obvious one is water, and that's one that we want to rely on most often. But we can also find fluids in tea and coffee, and these may or may not contain caffeine, and they may have a diuretic effect if they do, and sometimes that can lead to we might drink a little bit more, but it may lead to a higher fluid output. However, that might not always be the case. If you are a regular caffeine consumer, then that may not have as much of an effect for you, but just something to keep in mind. We can also find fluids from some of our drinkable dairy, so milk, kefir yogurt, drinkable yogurts. We can also find fluids from our juice, smoothies, especially if we're blending water or milk in these. And even if we're not blending up our fruits and vegetables into smoothies, if we're eating them in their whole form, we're still getting some fluid. And one thing that a lot of people forget about is soup and stew as a source of fluids. And last but not least, we also can find fluids in our pop and sports drinks. However, these don't provide very much nutrition, and they may not be the best source of hydration day to day. However, they might play a role when it comes to competition or training. But I certainly wouldn't want to rely on these as a hydration source throughout the day. Let's talk about nutrient-dense foods. And what I mean by nutrient-dense is that they are very high in some of our micronutrients. So micro meaning small. So these are smaller molecules that would not provide very much energy, but they would provide a lot of our important vitamins and minerals. So think about our vegetables. They are very low in calories, so they don't provide very many macronutrients. They won't provide our protein or very much of our protein, very little of those essential fats, and very little of that energy. But they are really high in our nutrients, our micronutrients, which are all really important for our overall health. So I want to keep this simple. Make sure you eat your vegetables. This is very worth emphasizing because these are really important factors and important foods to help keep us healthy. So eat your vegetables. So now let's put this all together. Take everything that we've learned and turn it into what we're going to eat at our meal, what we call our performance plate. So it's really important to know which foods fall into which categories. And once we know how to do that, we can adjust our portion sizes depending on the day, depending on how hard we're training. And this is going to help us build up that whole food nutrition foundation that I mentioned at the beginning. So let's go through an example of 3 different plates. So this is our performance plate, and it has 3 main sections. So we've got our grains and our starches, our meat and alternatives, and our vegetables. And we can adjust and tailor the portion sizes of each category depending on our training day, depending on how much energy we need. So this would be an example of an athlete who is following maybe a light training day. And so they might need a little bit less energy because they're not training or they're having a light day. So we really want to focus on a good portion, about a half of our plate, to be filled up with those nutrient-dense vegetables, getting our micronutrients, remember our vitamins, our minerals, and our fiber, all of those nutritious things. And just because we're maybe having a light day or a light training day, we need less energy, it doesn't mean we don't need any. So we still need to include some, and that's where we'd want to include a quarter of our plate with our grains and starches. These are the foods that are going to give us that energy. And we also want to include a quarter of our plate with our protein-containing foods, so foods from our meat and alternatives group. Maybe depending on the type of meal, maybe that's where we fit in our milk and alternatives for some protein as well. And these are going to be really important even though you might not be training that day, and you might not need to recover as hard or as quick. You might need to recover from the day before. So really important that we're getting those proteins in to help our muscles. And then on the right-hand side, of course, remembering to have that water, have that fluid with your meal. It would be a good idea to maybe have a fruit on the side. Depending on how you like to flavor your meals, adding in some extra spices, some fats and oils to get those essential fats, and all of that stuff to tie into your meal there. Now let's compare this to a moderate training day. So an athlete is doing a little bit more training this day, so that means they're going to need some more energy. And what we know is that our grains and starches, our carbohydrate foods, contain that energy that we need. So we want to increase and adjust that portion size on a day like this. So maybe having a third of our plate filled with our grains and starches. to help give our body that energy that we need for that training that day. And then our vegetables will be maybe closer to a third of our plate. And you see there that our protein stayed the same. It still stayed that quarter of the plate. We certainly want to include those protein foods. And let's take it one step further and look at a heavy training day. So this could be you're out on the water for training and you're in the gym, or you're doing 2 paddling sessions in a day. And so you're going to need more energy. So we can just swing that portion over one more and make our grains and starches half of our plate. And that's because we're doing more training that day, we're exerting more energy, so we're going to need to match that with our nutrition and get half of that plate filled with our grains and our starches, our carbohydrate-rich foods. And we're still going to reserve a quarter of our plate for those fiber-rich, nutrient-dense vegetables, and a quarter of our plate still stays with our protein foods to help with recovery. Of course, we're still drinking our water, getting some fruit on the side, adding in those essential fats as well, depending on our meal and what we choose to add for extra flavor and taste and so on. So thinking of these 3 different plates, so a light day or a recovery day, a moderate training day or a medium day, and a heavy training day, we want to match our energy with the type of day that we're having or the level of training that we're doing that day. So that if we're having a high training day, we want to match that with lots of energy coming from our food. And if we're having a low training day or recovery day, we want to really take advantage of getting a good portion of those nutrient-dense vegetables in, all that fiber, vitamins, minerals, because we know that that's good for us. So it's all about adapting that plate or switching up your portion sizes to match the energy that you're going to be using in your training. And with that, we reached the end of this first module. Thank you so much for listening. Please see the attached assignment and quiz related to the information that you just learned here. And once you're finished that, come meet me in the second module.